And welcome back to Cottage Talk. I am Russ Goldman. This is my interview with Thomas Buagh of Wolves blog. He's on today to talk about Fulham signing of Raúl Jiménez. I wanted to talk to Thomas. I've been on several shows with Thomas on the EPL Roundtable, and I thought the best person to really tell Fulham supporters all about Raúl Jiménez would be Thomas. So he's on today to give us his insight on the player and the person that Fulham are getting. Thomas, welcome to Cottage Talk. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, well, let's just get right into it. So this actually came as a little bit of a surprise to me. I started seeing this on Sunday, that Fulham were interested in Raúl Jiménez. Now, people are obviously going to make the link to Mitrovic. I don't see it as that way. I don't see the two linked. I can understand why fans of maybe Wolves and Fulham are thinking that. I just see this as a player that I think that Marco Silva really wanted to get to Fulham as a piece of the puzzle. That's the way I'm looking at it. But I'm curious your thoughts on this when you heard the news that Raúl Jiménez was leaving Wolves for Fulham.
Yeah, I don't think there was any surprise in the fact that Raúl was leaving Wolves. I think much was made of the fact that he was likely to be going this summer. Wolves were keen to get his salary off the books. I think he was a £100,000 a week player, one of our best paid players, and there's financial problems at Wolves. And you know, he was actually crying when he was applauding the fans at the last home game of last season, because I think he knew his exit was kind of imminent in the summer. And so I think there's no surprise that he's left. I think it's more of a surprise for Wolves supporters that he's remained in the Premier League. I think there was a feeling that he might end up in the MLS or back in Mexico somewhere. So it's probably a bit of a surprise, considering maybe that he's coming in off one of his poorest seasons. Well, definitely his poorest season for Wolves last season. That, you know, a Premier League club would want to pick him up, really. But I suppose he's developed a reputation over a number of years, and I think, like you said, perhaps Marco Silva, you know, sees that he can bring him back to something like the form he's shown in the past. So you know, an element of surprise that where he's ended up, but not really a great surprise that he's leaving Wolves.
Okay. And that's going to lead me to get your thoughts on the current Wolves manager, because I saw a report, and I could be wrong on this, but I think I saw a report. Basically, he was talking about the fact that he has nothing to do with transfers, but it seemed to me, if I'm reading between the lines, that he was not happy to see him go. I'm curious your thoughts on this. Am I reading into something, or do you think that is the case?
Well, I think the manager is concerned about what's happening at Wolves generally, because at the end of last season, he made it very clear that he felt that the squad needed significant strengthening if we were going to be able to achieve what he wanted to achieve with Wolves in the Premier League. And I think for Lopetegui, with the pedigree of manager he is, I think what he means by that is he wants to be in the top half of the Premier League, not scratching around in the relegation places at the bottom. So I think the feeling was with him was that with so many players going, and there has been considerable outgoings at Wolves over the summer, that Raúl actually, as the summer's evolved, he would have been a handy player to keep hold of, just because he's a good option to have. That being said, at the end of last season, Raúl was there and the manager wasn't using him. So I think it's a bit rich for the manager to come out now and go, well, you know, I would like to have kept him. But I think his comments on that were more about the squad in general, and the numbers we're seeing going out without anyone coming in, rather than, you know, this was a player I was really pinning my hopes on being, you know, important for Wolves in the coming year.
Okay. What's interesting, Thomas, and you and I have been on EPL Roundtable several times, and I reference you a great deal when I talk about Fulham and how that they can push on in the Premier League. And you tell me the cautionary tale of what happened with Wolves in the very beginning when you were at the Premier League. Basically, it's about keeping your key players. And now you're having a little bit of an exodus. There will be a lot of players coming in. Why is that so? Is it really just comes down to a financial issue with Wolves? Because I don't want to see Wolves struggle. It's a team I've got to know you that I want to see be in the top half of the table. So is this really about money with Wolves right now? But does it really start with letting so many good players go?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is. It comes down to recruitment. So it's your buying and selling, and the fact is that Wolves came up to the Premier League with a very good squad. They made some very good acquisitions in that first summer. João Moutinho, Raúl Jiménez, obviously. There was Adama Traore. These players, they had a value, but since we've been in the Premier League, our incoming business has not been good, and then gradually over time we've seen good players leave, those key players who were a big part of the Nuno team. So it is about your recruitment, and ultimately, because we've bought badly, we haven't been selling. We've been losing more on the players at the other end. Not getting the fees for them. A good example would be Goncalo Guedes, who we signed last summer for 30 million. Already, we can't offload this guy, and we're able to send him out on loan. So ultimately, it catches up with you if you don't do good business. And then it becomes about the finances. So because our recruitment's been so bad and we've spent so much money on these players, we're trying to get rid of them. And we're in a position now where we've got to balance the books, So.
Right. And this is something that I've talked a great deal on Cottage Talk, that I didn't want Fulham to get into the replacement game, Thomas. I want them to get in the building game. And I think part of it is what you're seeing with you at Wolves is that when you get into this replacement game, that you have to hit. And if you don't hit, like you said, then you run into the problem that you currently have. So that's why it's funny, because I've been on this Mitro kick. I don't want Fulham to sell because I don't want them to start the replacement game. I want them to start building and not replacing, even though I know the situation with Mitrovic is not good. I think it's valuable to keep him. And I look at your club, and I know it's not a like for like, but when I look at the Jota move, I look at Mitro, and I'm thinking, I don't want Fulham to go down that road.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we did discuss it last season, didn't we? And I think you kind of isolated Mitrovic and Palhinha. But it was inevitable that there would be interest in those players because they were playing at such a high level. And so I think there are a lot of people, analysts, that would say, well, it's inevitable that Fulham are going to have to sell those players at some point, because unless you're in the European football, then a player of Palhinha's quality, for instance, who was at the top of nearly every metric you could measure a brilliant midfielder by last season, he's going to attract interest from top clubs. So but what you would say is that you want, from Fulham's perspective, you want the owners to stand firm, demand the absolute maximum value you can get for those players, which I think you've seen already, because there's interest in, and I think they're kind of doing that with Mitrovic, but the issue there is that if the player desires the move for whatever reason, then it becomes very difficult for the club, doesn't it? So I think that's the problem. And players, as much as they're focused on the team, they're aware that they only get one career, and with the best will in the world, they try to maximise what they can do. So it makes it, when you're successful as Fulham were last season, this is always kind of an inevitability that you're going to have to weather some storm to do it. But what I would say is that first summer, Wolves came up and finished 7th in the Premier League. We were able to ward off the hunting masses for that first summer, maintain the squad, and do very well again the second season. So it is possible. Yeah, it is possible. So hopefully, Fulham can do that, and as you say, build in the short term, and not just get into losing one player and hoping they can replace him again. Because the reality is, if you sell Palhinha or you sell Mitrovic, it's very hard to get a like-for-like quality player, who's battle ready to go into the high level of competition that is the Premier League.
No, very good points, Thomas, and thank you for all that. So let's get back to talking about Raúl Jiménez, and let's talk about how have the supporters reacted to his move to Fulham.
I think there's a lot of goodwill and sentiment towards Raúl for two reasons. Firstly, he was probably the best number 9 we've had at the club in the modern era. Based on those first 2.5 seasons, he was at the club where he was scoring regularly. He was one of the top strikers in the Premier League, again, by any metric you want to judge strikers, goals, assists, link-up play. He was, superb. And then obviously he had that horrendous injury. That is something that no footballer, no sports person should have to deal with. You don't expect to get injuries of that nature. But the way he fought back, came back, and actually, in my opinion, had a very good season in that first season back, factoring in everything that was around that particular injury that he had. To come back and play at the elite level in the Premier League was something to be admired. And he's one of these players who really embraced the area. I mean, Wolverhampton's not London; it's not an affluent area, but he lived in the area. His family, his kids were born in Wolverhampton, and he had an affinity for the club, and it was just a mutual respect. And obviously, he was at Wolves at a time of great success. He made it to the Europa League quarter-final, and did very well in the Premier League for 2 years. So he was a big part of that. So very sad in that sense. But I think, most Wolves supporters would have said, all things considered, now's not a bad time for him to be moving on. For himself, because he'd kind of fallen down the pecking order at Wolves. Right. And I think he needed some fresh impetus. And obviously the hope was for Wolves that they were gonna bring in a replacement with whatever money we could generate with his sale. So it's a good move for Raúl. I think it's a good move for Wolves, and I think it's a good move for Fulham. So it's one of those things where I think it should suit all parties, really.
And that's what you want, Thomas. You want a win-win for everyone. And I think we might have that. And we'll talk about that at the end of the show, what type of player Fulham could be getting with Raúl Jiménez. But before we do that, I want to go back and I want to talk about Raúl Jiménez, the person. And I was recommended to watch Code Red. And I got to tell you, if you watch Code Red and anyone listening or watching this, please do watch it, the actual video, because it is heartbreaking to watch, but you also get to see the love of the supporters for Raúl. You get to learn a lot about Raúl. I got to learn a lot about Nuno. There's so much in it, but I think you really get to see, as you said just a few minutes ago, how much he enjoyed his time at Wolverhampton. I mean, he made himself part of the community. I think what Fulham are getting, based on what I watched and what you've told me, we're getting a quality person, Thomas.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. You are getting a quality person. I think when he came to Wolves, he very much said, because he'd been at Atletico Madrid, he'd been at Benfica, and he'd not really had the opportunities there that he wanted, and he felt that he backed his own ability. And so when he came to Wolves, he said, I just want to feel like an important player in the team. I want to lead a team and show that I can be the main man, the main centre forward. So he came with that determination. And, he achieved that very much, as we said. But, when he had that setback, and it's a serious setback, a career-changing injury, like I say, that shows you everything you need to know about the man, that he's able to lift himself up from that and come back. And I never got the sense with him that it was about, I want to come back to have my career, and obviously the financial aspects of that and what the implication would have been had he not come back. I think with him it was he needed to play. He's a competitor. It's what he loves doing, being out on the pitch. And I think that comes across in Code Red as well, doesn't it? And you are getting a top quality person. He's never really put a foot wrong at Wolves. There was a slight question mark at the start of last season because he clearly wanted to go to the World Cup with Mexico. And the supporters felt maybe, he was kind of hedging his bets a little in recovering from his injury, kind of timing it more so he could make that Winter World Cup than get back and, play for Wolves. But that's all rumour and conjecture anyway. But of course, like I say, his connection with the fans has never been anything but superb. He's what a fan favourite. His song is always going around the stadium. And he's always been very mutually respectful, applauding the fans before and after the games. And yeah, the Wolves fans love him, and it's him and his wider family. His partner and his kids. I'd never like to use the term family club because it kind of suggests a kind of small club, doesn't it? When I don't think Wolves are a small club, but he certainly cultivated that idea of sort of one family, the Wolf Pack. He kind of personified that, really.
Okay, excellent stuff. All right. Coming up next, I'm going to talk to Thomas about Raúl Jiménez's career at Wolves and then what type of player are Fulham getting. Okay, Thomas, we're back. So let's now talk about, we're going to go before injury and then after injury. So let's talk about his time before the injury. Scored a ton of goals for Wolves. I've actually watched the highlight package. Some unbelievable goals Raúl Jiménez scored for your side. And you actually said this to me in messages going back and forth, that you truly believe that if he did not get injured, he might end up with a Champions League side. That tells you how well he was playing for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there was 2 seasons in the Premier League. The second season, he got something like, I don't know what he got, 28 goals or something in all competitions, 17 in the Premier League, I think. He was at the absolute top of his game. And I was very surprised in that summer, because that was the summer that Jota went to Liverpool for 42 million. I was very surprised no one came in with a similar sort of offer for Raúl Jiménez. I think Wolves kind of priced him out of the move. I think he was kind of agitating a little bit for a move, because I think he'd seen linked with Man United and other teams, and he was doing that thing of talking in the press about he'd be open to move. So I think he thought that move was coming, and then for whatever reason it didn't materialise, and Wolves ended up signing him to a new long-term contract, which was actually to his benefit, you know, because he not too long after he kind of had that injury, and you know, it probably gave him a bit of security having that contract extension on better terms. But yeah, he was a fantastic player. He led the line very well. Wolves played with a kind of one up front. We were a counter-attacking team, so quite a lot of the time he was the only guy up the pitch, and he was having to make things out of very little, and then react very quickly when Wolves were breaking at speed and getting himself into good positions in the box. And he was a creator as well as being a scorer. You know, he made a lot of assists. He was a fantasy football favourite, I think, for those two. He was accruing a lot of points that way. Just a very complete striker. He's not like rapidly fast. He's not incredibly strong, but he's just got a bit of everything. He's just a very good, technically sound footballer. And when he was bang at it, he was one of the best strikers in the Premier League. I mean, you've got your Harry Kanes, you've got your Haalands now, I suppose. I don't think he was quite at that level, but certainly when you go down the run and maybe you compare to someone like an Ivan Toney at Brentford and a Mitrovic, I suppose, to an extent at Fulham, a player who's just below maybe that rung on the ladder. That's where he was at the absolute pinnacle. So it would have been no surprise at all to me to see him play for an Arsenal or a Man United or another top European club.
Wow, very interesting stuff there. And I think that I agree with you that he was on that path. So I don't want to really go into talking about the injury. It's funny because when I watched it on Code Red, it really bothered me watching it. And you and I been messaging back and forth. I know your thoughts about the player who was also involved, and I actually agree with you. I don't want to really focus on that. I want to focus on his return. So his return, I'm glad that you already said this. You believe that when he did return to Wolves a year later, that he actually had a good season. It was the season after that he dropped off. So I'm curious why you saw this drop off. And I'm also curious, how much of a factor do you think Nuno leaving affected Jimenez? Because on Code Red, I could see the affection between the two of them. Did this have an effect on him in his playing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult one to know. I mean, I would imagine if there was an effect in that first season, it would have been more to do with the kind of psychological effects of dealing with a different manager. I think what Wolves did quite well when Nuno left is that Bruno Lage, who came in after, brought a certain level of continuity. He didn't really radically change the style of the club. So I think on the pitch, the tactics still suited Raúl reasonably well. It was a similar sort of setup and drill. But yeah, I mean, Nuno was very emotionally connected to that whole thing as he's shown in Code Red. So I imagine it would have changed something in him. But it's clear when he came back that it was, he was changed inextricably. He was never going to go back to being the old Raúl Jiménez, because visually, immediately looking at him, he's got this big headband on. He can't, with the best will in the world, he's not going to stick his head into the areas of the of a crowded penalty area when there's boots flying, when he's had brain damage effectively in his in his recent past. So with the best will in the world, he was forever changed as a player. Because if you look at the goals he was scoring immediately before he got the injury, he was towering over players. He was jumping over defenders, was smashing headers in. He was putting himself into these areas where number 9s go to score goals. In that tunnel of uncertainty between the goalkeeper and the defence across that 6-yard box. So he was changed forever, and you could see in that first season he wasn't going to win the headers in the same way. And when he was getting up and getting his head on the balls, you were finding they were kind of going a bit squiff. And I think that's because obviously he's wearing this apparatus on his head, which over time has actually slimmed down, and it's become less and less, and it's less noticeable now than it was. But clearly that's the big area of his game, which is obviously completely understandable. You have a serious head injury like that. Every time the ball's in the air, even if you've got the best will in the world, you're not going to attack that ball as aggressively as you would, prior to having had that injury, especially when you know what's at stake. So,
Okay, very good, my friend. All right, so that's going to lead us to talk about what type of player are Fulham getting here. Now, you already talked about what he has been like after the injury, and it's a terrible injury, and I wish him only the best, and I want him to succeed in the worst possible way. But in your opinion, what type of player do you think Fulham are getting right now?
I still think he's a fairly complete player in the sense that he's very good at manipulating the ball. He's very good at taking up good positions in the penalty area. He can come and get involved with the play. He can run in behind. He can still do a bit of everything. My feeling is generally that if you play in a team where you're playing higher up the pitch and you can get the ball to him in and around the penalty area, I still think he's going to score goals. I still think if the chances are created, he will convert them if you get the ball at his feet in the right areas. And that's where Wolves fell short badly in recent years. I mean, you only have to look at our offensive numbers. We don't score goals and we don't create very many chances. So it's, I think his deterioration, you can look at it and go, well, Wolves aren't scoring because Raúl wasn't scoring, or you can go, well, Raúl wasn't scoring because Wolves weren't creating. And I'm more of that school of thought. My feeling with Raúl was we're not getting the ball to him in the right areas of the pitch to give him the type of chances he needs to score goals. That's not to say he didn't miss chances. He did miss chances, but I still feel in the right team he can be a 10 to 15 goal striker.
Wow.
If he's getting the right level of the chances. I mean, what I would say the concern would be if I was a Fulham supporter is if he is the replacement for Mitrovic. If it is Mitrovic going and they're hoping Raúl can come in, the obvious discrepancy you've got there is that Mitrovic was the biggest, probably the biggest towering striker in terms of headed goals and aerial duels won in the attacking third of the pitch. You're going to drop off in that numbers because he's not going to do that. I mean, even before the injury, he wasn't really a player who dominated defenders and won loads of headers and brought others into play. That wasn't really his game anyway, but it's certainly even less so. So I mean, I think if you're playing him instead of Mitrovic, then I would expect the style of the team to have to evolve to compensate for that. But Fulham did well last season
without him.
Yeah, without Mitrovic. So there's no reason that that the style of play can't suit him, and you can't get the best out of him in that system. But I mean, on a plus, just to counter that, what you are getting is an exceptional penalty taker.
I
think if you
we could use that, Thomas.
Yeah,
we could use that.
I don't think he's ever missed in the Premier League.
Wow, that's actually really good.
Yeah, the only penalty he's ever missed for Wolves, annoyingly, was in the Europa League quarter-final against Sevilla. But if you watch on YouTube his technique, he's got that nice sort of stuttering run-up and he waits for the goalie. He nearly always scores. He always scores in the Premier League. I think he's got 100% record. So I know Mitrovic, and you missed some penalties last season. So maybe there's a plus there for you.
Yeah, that would actually be a plus, Thomas. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I really, again, I'm looking forward to seeing him play. I have been on this kick that he's not a Mitrovic replacement, that he's just a piece of the puzzle. And I think if he's used correctly, Thomas, and I know that you've watched Fulham a little bit, the one thing I will say is that when players come to play under Marco Silva, he does get the best out of them. So many players have improved, and I think that's the thought process here. And ironically, there was a lot of speculation with the future of Marco Silva last Saturday night. And ironically, the next day, after I think a meetup with the owner, he is now all of a sudden Fulham are interested in Raúl Jiménez. I'm actually thinking that the meeting between the Fulham owner and then, of course, Marco led to some movement here, because I saw an interview with Raúl and he said this happened within 72 hours. So the timeline tells me, I'm speculating, but I think this is Marco's pick. I think Marco really wanted him, Thomas, and that to me is a good sign.
Yeah. I mean, that is. I mean, I think it's just a good fit all around. I mean, as I said, I think Raúl, you need to get the ball to him in the right areas of the pitch. And I think Raúl said himself when he signed for the club, he likes Craven Cottage. He likes that pitch. It's one of those grounds where I think it suits certain players, like technical players. And I just feel it's a nice matchup for him. I can see him doing very well, particularly in those home games where the pitch can seem a bit tighter and it can become quite a technical game at Craven Cottage. I think that will suit him. So maybe that's the thinking. And I mean, going back to what we said about the aerial stuff and the potential strength of Mitrovic against a perceived weakness of Raúl's game. They're not idiots, the people who run these clubs. They run these they run these statistical analysis, and Marco Silva's a shrewd coach, and he will know exactly the style of the player that he wants. And if it is a case that Raúl's going to be the man leading the line, he'll know exactly what he's going to get from him. It's not like he hasn't watched football for the last 2-3 years and isn't aware of the major attributes and the shortcomings of these players. So I just think it's smart business. I know you picked him up for peanuts, really, in terms of money. It's as close as you'll get to a free transfer, without being a free transfer. So I just think it's a no-brainer, and it's not the only signing Fulham are going to make this summer. It's going to be changes there, and it's just exciting, to see how it all slots together and what the plan is.
Well, thank you for sharing all that, Thomas. I do want to just share just one detail, because I did mention that I knew that the Fulham manager and the owner were speaking. I was actually at an event. I've not shared this publicly. I'm going to say this now. I overheard a conversation that basically was that Marco Silva was meeting with Shah Khan, because Shah Khan apparently was possibly going to an event I was going to be at. He couldn't be there because he was meeting with Marco. And then the next thing you know, the next day, everything is on the right plane with Fulham and Marco Silva. And then all the talk of Jimenez starts. So I think this is all positive. I think that he is a player that Marco wanted, and that's a positive sign for me, my friend. All right. Well, Thomas, listen, thank you for talking with me for about a half hour. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
No problem at all, Russ. Thanks for having me on, and hopefully speak to you in the season when it's going well for both of us. Fingers crossed.
I hope so. I hope it goes well for both sides. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Cottage Talk. Thank you so much for my very special guest, Thomas Buagh from Wolves Blog, but it is time to go. My name is Russ Goldman. Thank you as always for watching and listening to Cottage Talk, part of the talkSPORT Fan Network.